All right, welcome, Mauricio.
Thank
Coming
you.
from Richmond, Virginia. You're a
Yeah,
narrative sex therapist.
that's right.
So can you tell us a little bit about your work? Just those two.
Sure. So I'll start with so I am a certified sex therapist through ASECT, which is the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And I've also trained in narrative therapy, which is a modality, an approach to working with people that is person first, decentered, in terms of how therapist and client interact. And so, having those two trainings, I've combined them, and it's just I work with populations that struggle with challenges related to their sexual experiences, their sexual identities, and shame, which is always, not always, but oftentimes present in people's ways of relating to their sexual lives.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's like a big obstacle or a big storyline to flush out. Definitely.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, and tell me about so in our narrative trainings we met in 2015 at the narrative therapy intensive in Toronto, and and then you said before we started recording that one thing that's really stuck with you is the danger of a single story, and I mentioned that Asante mentioned this in our interview as well, and I forget the name of the woman, the author who gives the TED talk.
Chimamanda Adichie.
That's right, exactly.
Mhm.
She has amazing quotes too about the danger of the one track narrative related to culture, but even the internalized narratives that we carry. And you're relating that to stigma and psychiatric diagnosis, especially in the realm of sexual health. Maybe you could say a bit about that.
Yeah. So in 2015, when we went to the summer intensive, which is where I met you, we were shown a TED talk by this author, Chimamanda Adichie, and it's called The Dangers of a Single Story. So it's a great 15-minute TED talk. And this was a narrative intensive. So it talked a lot about, she talked about the how we internalize messages and how we lose a world of possibilities when we think of ourselves in singular ways, but also when we think about others, individuals or communities in singular ways. So she really emphasized, in the training, also emphasized the idea of being multi-storied. And I guess I should explain. I went to the training because I was looking for something else than what I had been taught in graduate school. I When I was in this is back in 2011 probably, or 2010, when I was in getting my master's in human sexuality. We had a person who identified as a pedophile come speak to us in our class. And before he came, I remember having all of these assumptions about him, and I was really nervous, and I didn't really want to be part of the class even. But we showed up and we listened, and I was really shocked about my reaction, because I felt compassion for him, because he not only talked about his identity as a pedophile, but he also talked about his family, he talked about his career, he talked about his hopes, his dreams. And so I was thinking, okay, how do you work with somebody like this therapeutically when you have all of these myths and misconceptions about not only just this population, but about the act of sexual offending, or uh, and the differences between what it means to identify as one and offending. I mean, all of these things. I was like, my mind was blown. So I sat with that for a while. I started working with youth who committed sexual offenses, which is a completely different population, but that guest speaker did get me to think a little bit about stigmatized identities in relation to sexuality. And so I just, using the typical cognitive behavioral therapy, other person-centered, strength-based usually was what I was drawn to, but I still felt like it was not enough. Which is how I came to narrative therapy. And when I found narrative therapy, it just was such a good fit for the work that I wanted to accomplish with these folks, but also it just really fit for my own narrative, my own story. I felt vindicated in so many ways personally. And I said to myself, this is something I want to be able to do in my work. I don't want to do therapy in any other way because it just didn't really feel right. So that's how I got to Toronto. That was my first narrative training. And in being there, that's when the video was shown, and immediately it was just such an excellent fit. And I thought, okay, this is it. I need to keep digging in, understanding this approach better. And so I continued training. And so when I meet with clients, the number one thing is I'm thinking, what are the stories that they're telling themselves or that others have been telling about them based on an identity or a label that they've been given? And then that's the number one thing that I want to do is tackle that and unpack that, figure out the effects that it has on that person's life. And if a lot of the challenges that they're reporting, that they're talking about, are more just a result of the shame and the stigma that comes with whatever label they have. And it usually is the case.
Right. It's like how a label may perpetuate stigma and shame, but
Mhm.
then perpetuates more of identifying with the label and identifying with the problem. And then it makes it very difficult to address the problem. I think Michael White, one of the founders, says, oh, you're probably going to know the quote better than I, but this idea of externalizing conversations where you externalize the problem from the person, because if the people are problems, you can't solve the problem without destroying the person. There's a
Right.
better quote. There's a better version of this quote.
Well, the quote is exactly what you just said. He just it was, the person is not the problem is the problem.
Right.
Just, how could it not resonate with most of us? And it's the idea of separating behavior from identity, or a sense of self. Who we are is not always what we do. And so if we are, if others are always highlighting experiences of our lives that only fit one storyline, and we are, we are bound to believe it and confirm it by behaving in ways that fit that reality. And often it's not the reality that we would prefer to have. It's
Yeah.
not the preferred ways that we want to perceive ourselves, but it is what we've been told over and over again. And so we perpetuate it with our behaviors, um, and just confirm it.
Yeah. And it's kind of something that's appears to be common sense if you think about like a kid in school who's the quote unquote problem child, the class clown. He's like, well, I'm gonna do what you expect me to do.
Yeah,
You're giving me a chance to live in another story.
yeah. I that's part of the personal story. I was that problem child growing up. I was expelled from school. I went through a lot as a kid, but and I feel like through my years in middle school and high school, I just kept repeating the same mistakes and I kept engaging in the same behaviors because I thought that was the only thing that was expected of me. And of course, you get older, you get wiser, you get more sophisticated in your pranks and your behaving, and it was getting worse until I got expelled from school. And I don't know exactly what it was, but it happened after a really big shift in my life when I changed my life. And that big shift was when I decided to move from Lima, which is where I grew up, to the US. And just not knowing anything and having to sort of start from zero, not knowing the language, not having any friends. I moved here with my mother, who I had not grown up with. She was living in the US. So it's such a big shift in my life that it really forced me to look at what else there was about me. And I don't think that a lot of people have that opportunity to question the single stories, and therefore change their lives. Most people believe those messages and just keep keep on that one pathway, which tends to lead to more problem experiences, more struggles, more circumstances that are unwanted. Um, so creating that movement and the big shift is part of the conversations that I like to have with people.
Because you could create a new identity, being sort of lifted out of the old context that you were in. And this is an opportunity to do that through therapy without having to move to an entirely different country, you know?
Exactly. It's almost like going to a different country in conversation.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
and it's almost like identity is so multi-storied, right? That some of it is just not accessible because we've only been hearing the one thing about us. I was a problem child, but I also was really caring, and I also was very loyal as a child, and I valued relationships deeply. So all of those things were not looked at. They were not. Also, a lot of the challenges that I struggled with that were not inherently mine that happened to me. Those things also were not acknowledged because we were so focused on my problem behaviors and me being a problem child. Um, and I still see remnants of that storyline in my life today. I'm 30. I'm going to be 34 soon, and so I still see it. But it's not a single story anymore. It's just one story that is part of a bigger picture. And that's what I hope to be able to do for clients, is for them to see that, okay, this one thing about me that's been bothering me for years doesn't have to be the only thing about me. And it changes the relationship that we have with that thing. It fully does.
Yeah, because when you have these other threads of narrative in addition to the problem story, it gives you some movement in terms of what you said, what you want or what you prefer in terms of identity. It's like, yes, I have a problem story where I'm a problem child, but I'm also a caring child, and that story is often not fleshed out because I'll commit these caring acts, or there are people who know this about me, but we kind of like tuck that away to focus on the problem story instead.
It's like the biggest thing, right? You could be helping a classmate get their work done, or you could like walk a friend to home because they don't want to walk by themselves. And you do all of these things, but no one's noticing them. They're noticing when you're misbehaving or doing something problematic in class. You get so these moments, like you get suspended or you get taken to the principal's office or you get reprimanded in front of everybody, they become kind of like a little peak in a storyline. And so that's what we see, right? That's what's on the surface. And we don't see everything else. But I think it's, you know, this training and narrative ways of understanding the world would be helpful for teachers and anyone who's part of anyone's formative years. This would really help people be able to see themselves as more than just the one thing.
Yeah, to open up possibilities and get curious about, well, I wonder why Mauricio walked his friend home.
Yeah.
That's not really a problem story narrative. It's not a problem child narrative. That's a different narrative. It's not just an anomaly in your life. It actually carries with it an entire narrative thread.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It speaks to something else that, like you said, needs to be fleshed out. And it needs to be fleshed out for the person to also be able to acknowledge that that's a thing about me. And that's something that could be a starting point to a future decision, to more possibilities. If my only starting point is problem child, then really there's only few storylines ahead of me for my future. Like I always heard things like, you're going to end up in jail, you're going to end up dead, or you're going to hurt somebody. And these were my only paths in front of me, and there were other paths. Had I noticed some of my other things since I was a child. Luckily, I had the opportunity to early enough. I was 14 when I moved to the US to have this, change of heart about myself and really do more for myself.
And I mean, this kind of brings us back, or it pulls up the idea of labels, because before we recorded, we were talking about this. And this is an interesting thing, like this idea of diagnosis, especially with mental health, like the psychiatric diagnosis, the wonderful DSM-5. Now we're version 5, right? This is
I don't
I
know.
don't really work with
I
DSM.
think we're version 5, updated, and new billing codes. It's all about the updates. I think are mostly about how to bill.
Okay, yeah, because now we're in
Which is the
ICD
problem.
11, and
Yeah.
which has a few problem stories embedded in there.
So
we
many.
can we can we can unpack all that, but this idea, and I think we were talking before about this. Well, narrative therapy will always question when someone comes in with a label. I have bipolar disorder, for example, or I am a sexual offender. There's always this question of, so what is that? What do you think about that label? Part of that is just decentering as a practitioner or a therapist, to allow the client or the patient to be able to decide, how that fits. And then we had this conversation about sometimes people can, and I've definitely had the experience when patients will come in and feel some sort of relief around having been given a diagnosis. And then you were mentioning the conversation that you have, which is to ask about and to sort of unpack that sense of why would that be freeing, or is that, let's understand that a little bit more, yeah.
Yeah, and so when we ask, a lot of clients, like you said, come in wanting to hear an answer to their question: what's wrong with me? Why am I behaving like this? Why is this happening to me? Or to solve the problem, whatever the problem is. And oftentimes people don't know what the problem is. And I have had many clients like ask for a diagnosis, and if that's what they want, we get them there if that's something that they truly desire. But before I get them to a label, I do like to unpack the reasoning why that's important to them. And usually those conversations lead to understanding that how labels have become, categories have become so important in culture, and how categories are limiting. And luckily, I've been able to witness clients saying, you know what, no, I don't think I'm going to be free by knowing this. There's better ways of getting there, of addressing what's happening or making a change. Um, and I think also emphasizing the role of movement, right? It doesn't have to be that I get labeled this and then what? I say to people, well, maybe if we create movement, you'll look at this behavior from a different perspective, and the label wouldn't even fit that well. So that's another thing. And most people are very receptive to it. Those who stick with me and give me an opportunity to help them in these ways have really separated from uh, any shaming that comes with whatever labels they've been attaching to themselves and others have attached to them. And also, I like to start I think of therapy as a storyline itself, right? A lot of people come to therapy for the first time, or those who have come to therapy, often I work a lot with youth. They came from having seen a lot of other professionals. And so there is this storyline that they've built, that they need someone else to tell them how to behave, how to be, to change them. And what I like to do is as soon as I meet them, is to make a dent, to poke a hole in that storyline so that it doesn't become too thickened. And one of the ways that I do that is by doing an assessment, but instead of the person, I do an assessment on the context that the person is in. I will do an assessment on, tell me about your school, tell me how the school is, tell me what you like about the school, tell me what you don't like about the school, tell me about the family. And really just understanding the context, diagnosing the context, and then thinking about how this person is reacting or responding to the context as it is being described.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was actually just having a conversation with a colleague who's another naturopathic doctor, and we talk about this idea of root cause versus a good assessment, because we throw around the term root cause all the time, but can you ever really understand the root cause? There's so many factors, but that's such the gathering information to create an assessment is so important in saying, okay, so because I think in psychiatry, there's typically two narratives, you know, so we've gotten the initial narrative, which was there's something wrong with you, snap out of it, which was very damaging and very stigmatizing. Then we got a second narrative that was slightly better, which was like, it's not your fault, it's a biological disease.
Yeah.
And there's a medication to fix it, just like we have medications for diabetes or thyroid disorder. And then that does take a little bit of weight off it because it's not your fault, but it kind of ends the story there, right? Because it's like, okay, you have a disease, here's medication, but
Yeah.
it doesn't take away all the suffering. And
Right.
so
And
people are still coming in asking for help, right?
and if the option that the more positive one that you just described, if that option is given to people and the suffering continues, then more often than not, people will go to the other option, the other alternative, right? Because if it's not working, if the meds are not fixing me, then it must be the other thing.
Uh-huh.
Must be me. I gotta do something.
Uh-huh.
And well, that message often makes people want to search for more help, maybe more therapists. But if the suffering continues, then that also continues. That storyline, if there's something wrong with me, keeps getting thicker and thicker.
Totally.
So we gotta find alternative ways for people to engage with their own sense of self, with their mind, with their spirit. That it's not these only two options. This very binary way of looking at living condition.
That you're sort of just flip-flopping between. So it's like, okay, if the medical storyline's not working, it's the something's wrong with me storyline, or we just keep trying to find a solution to the medical storyline, maybe wrong diagnosis, maybe wrong medication, and keep going, which could have some validity. But there's, like you said, so many, there's probably like 100 or 10,000 other storylines in terms of you, the student, in the crap school you went to, that, you know, whatever, and all of these ways that may be contributing to the distress.
And
You
how
know.
we react to clients, it's so important. You know, I am uh, it's one of the most important things to me is to really be non-pathologizing and non-judgmental. And I say one of the things that I tell clients is, if you've got something to tell somebody that you feel like the world would judge you about, I want to be that person that you can tell to. And there'll be absolutely no judgment. Anything that you want to tell me. And unfortunately, not unfortunately, you can edit that. We have the reporting laws. In some cases, you have to break that confidentiality. But you know, with that, in telling people upfront that that's a thing, anything else that they want to just release, they can. And the act of talking about something that they've never talked about to anyone, it's healing in its own. I also was thinking when you were talking about psychiatry, you know, not just psychiatry, but just mental health in general. I feel like we are, you know, if we don't give people these alternatives, that it's either their problem, they need to figure it out, or that it's biological and here's some medications for you. I think the other option that quickly comes to mind is culture and social society, right? And how culture and society play a role in some of people's suffering. But that's maybe too abstract of an idea. And I think that as mental health professionals have become very uncomfortable with uncertainty, and we want to give people answers. And if we, honestly, I feel like as a therapist, not having the answer is great because I get to explore that with my clients. I get to ask questions that I don't have answers to. And that's so imperative in the work that you do with people. And I think we need to be a little bit more comfortable with the uncertainty of not knowing, just not knowing really what's going on, and we shouldn't.
It's true, because as you're saying this, I'm like, I definitely, as a practitioner, I'm like, okay, so if somebody's root cause or as part of an assessment we do that's contributing to their suffering is racism and poverty, it's like, what can I as a clinician do about that? You know, so we stray away from that, even though that might be the root, but because there's no answer, I don't know how to fix it for you, you know. But that's the beauty of narrative therapy, is that you're just pulling out that storyline and really and thickening it for the person so that they can get away from those two like biological or I'm the problem. Yeah, let's pull out the sociological context, you know.
Yeah, and it's also the way that people respond to their suffering. I like to think of responses. Michael White and I forget who else that wrote about responses to trauma. And I am very attached to that idea, and not just trauma. I think with anything in life, even when we make a mistake, working with youth who committed sexual offenses, the sexual offense is such a big deal, but then they also feel so much guilt and so much remorse, and you can build a story that uses that remorse as a starting point, as opposed to the sexual offense. So also, I think Chimamanda Adichie in that TED Talk says, where would you like to start the story, or how would you like to start the story really colors how it will be interpreted and what messages you're really going to put out there about people. So that's really important, is thinking about how are people responding to it. Something as simple as, you know, the anxiety is causing me this much distress and it has a complete handle on my life, like not handle, a complete hold on my life. And then just something so simple as, oh, and even though all of that, you're still looking for a therapist to work in that. That's a response that we should think about and where that comes from. You know, and I think the responses give us so much story. We focus on the problem, but just those responses are probably more powerful, really.
And we often, they're often kind of just like, oh, okay, great. Like, you know, in a court of law, oh, okay, feels remorse, so therefore your sentence a little bit lower or whatever. But there's a whole narrative, like you said, that can begin with that will pull out a really important part of that person's identity and creates a completely different future.
It supports the work forward. You know, if I start a conversation with a kid who committed a sexual offense with their remorse, then it really gives them hope to do well in treatment, to overcome these challenges, to apologize to those that they need to apologize, to take full accountability for their actions, and to still believe that they are good people that can be excellent contributors to society. Because most of these youth are, I mean, probably good 99% of them are not bad people. And so I think that just letting them know, yeah, this was a really bad thing that happened, that you did, but it's not who you are. And who you are, to me, seems to be more about how you're responding. Why are you so hurt about what you did? What does that tell you about what matters to you? What's important to you?
Right, because behind remorse and guilt are huge values that you can start to thicken. That are not being told, you know, by most of the people that they're probably interacting with.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. And I mean, there's also this idea too, I think, around, you know, in the work you do with sex, this idea of, which I think I've seen you write about before, of this problem with the term sex addiction, or I think now they call it compulsive sexual behavior, and that's, I think, an ICD-11 term now. I think it's a new term. Is that,
I think it was rejected from being included in the DSM, but they've come up with ways of still diagnosing it. Yes, I haven't really thought about it that much recently, because I've been doing a lot of work in other areas, but I used to work, I still do have some clients, but I used to work a lot with men who described having a sex addiction. And from a narrative perspective, but also my training in sexuality, that is a term that, first of all, is not scientifically proven that it's a thing. And there's a whole camp that it's really strongly believes that sex addiction is real and that people need to be helped with it and whatnot. But I hear that argument as well, and I understand it and I appreciate it for what it is. But I truly believe that sex addiction, a lot of it is shame around sexuality. So if people are engaging in behaviors that are atypical, sexual behaviors that are atypical, then then most likely they're engaging in these in secrecy, which is one of the components of sex addiction, for instance. And so that makes the label more real, but it's really, if you think of it, it's more the shame and how culture relates to sexuality. And then we also have you know, the way that the people engage in certain behaviors, like I'm thinking of affairs, men having affairs, cheating on their partners. A lot of the people that I worked with would come to me because their wives were pushing them to get therapy because of sexual addiction. And honestly, I think for a lot of the people that I worked with, that was a cop out. I think that the messages about masculinity and what it means to be a man are probably the biggest challenge, the biggest issue here, and not an actual sex addiction. I think that the sexual behavior and how you're responding to it is because you've been given an opportunity to do those things in society as a man. That's that's just as simply as I can put it. And you can, you know, I'm not saying that people don't have urges or more of like a compulsive aspect to it, but then we're thinking about maybe more of an anxiety
Right.
issue and not so much of a sexual issue. It's a
Right.
very complicated idea, and I think we still don't have all the answers to it. But I, you know, from what we have, there is no science that tells me that I should call this what people go through sex addiction. And but if that's what a client wants to call it, then we do call it like that, and we externalize it that way. But it is. I do a little bit of education with clients about the word, the phrase, the label sex addiction, and then I give them resources for them to read up a little bit on that, so they can make their own decision on how they want to proceed with the therapy, if they still want to refer to it as sex addiction, or if they've shifted the way they think about it based on the some of the readings that they've done and whatnot.
Right, because in a different sociocultural context, would the same behavior still be a problem, you know, or in a different relationship even, like just
Exactly.
slightly tweak the
Good point.
context, you know?
Good
Yeah.
point. Even in a relationship, it might look differently. You're absolutely
Yeah,
right.
right. This is different structures, right? But there is a single narrative for relationship structure in many cases too. And it's
Yeah.
often not sort of discussed, like what do we actually prefer in terms of how we share sexuality.
So I'll tell you quickly. I had a person that I was seeing who was in a religious monogamous relationship for a very long time, and came in for sex addiction. Years later, that person was no longer in that relationship, was with someone else, and they had, I believe, I don't know if it was polyamorous or open relationship, but one of those. And that was not a concern to them. They were coming back to me for something else. And so it's interesting that you said that comment and made me think about that case
Yeah, like
immediately.
fixed my addiction by just getting into a relationship where that's it's accepted and not
Mhm.
shamed or stigmatized behavior.
And they reshaped their relationship with their spirituality, and I mean, a lot of it had changed. That all that was needed was a shift in the context, something with the context.
Yeah, because and I mean, we started off by mentioning shame and stigma around sexuality, and it seems that that's probably the place where there's a lot of story thickening that happens, or yeah.
Nice. Religion, yeah, yeah.
Right. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Oh gosh, yes.
Yeah. What are people? So right now you're working your PhD.
Yeah,
And what's your thesis? You mentioned it was working with child sexual offenders, and yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So my PhD is in social work, and which is what my degree. I have an MSW in a human sexuality degree, uh, and so I decided to go back to school for social work. I considered going back to school for sexuality. There's a few programs, but social work really just the whole strengths based idea, person and environment is just always something that has fit. And so I decided to go back to school. I got a little taste of teaching as an adjunct in Denver, and I really liked it. And students responded to a lot of what I was telling them. Um, I taught narrative when I was not supposed to be teaching narrative. Um,
It's always
and
snuck
so,
in, you know.
I mean, it always did, but students responded so well, so well. And I even got a little award
Oh,
as a teacher of the year in
whoa,
Denver. And so that
congrats.
was pretty cool. And so it made me really think, okay, I do have some sort of gift in communicating these ideas to students. So I wanted to go back to school. And interestingly, I ended up in a really research heavy program, which was not where I wanted to be, but I not the program, the research world. But I've learned that I actually really appreciate it and like it in that you can really disseminate information in different ways through research. And
Mm.
so what I'm doing now is when I started my career, I was working with youth who committed sexual offenses, and so I decided to go back to that population because they really not only are they stigmatized in society, but the resources they have are very scarce. In particular, their families. There's so much that these youth have to go through, and it is the parents that have to um, that are responsible for most of what these youth have to go through, and the parents have really zero support. And I know that there are some places like the UK has some programs, and there are few things that are coming up to help parents, but not enough. And there certainly is not enough research on parents of these youth. And so that is what I'm focusing my research while I'm in school is understanding what are the challenges that these families are going through, what are their needs, their responses. Specifically, I'm looking at how they're responding to their youth having committed a sexual offense and using those responses to create a counter story of their lives. And hopefully be able to influence implementation of new services for parents specifically, for them to know that they're not alone, that navigating the judicial system, the youth system is, I don't know in Canada, but in the US is it's just every state is so different, and it is very, very challenging for families. And so just to know other parents who have gone through it and have been successful at navigating it and coming out on the other side and living complete, full lives as families together, despite the challenges. I think it can give parents this chance to see themselves as capable, and that despite this really horrible thing going on in their lives, that they can really overcome it. But there's really not a lot of services like that, and we need to do more. And I'm also thinking single mothers. I remember growing up, not growing up. Well, I grew up with a single grandmother, but um, I was thinking that in my work when I started, a lot of the families that I worked with were single mothers who had more than one child. And so this kid had to be attending appointments, they had to be going to court hearings, and they had to do this or that. And especially families where the victim was also part of the family. These parents had like a million appointments a day, plus full-time jobs and picking up the kids from school. There's a disruption in kids, the siblings' lives. And so these parents didn't have a lot of support. And I don't know how they did it all, but they were still doing it. So that's the research. It's really try and figure out what's going on, elevating their voices, and then coming up with some ideas to really create some supportive services for them.
What are you seeing in the realm of responses? I mean, is the research too young for this, or are you starting to see some stuff emerge?
I'm seeing some stuff emerging already. Right now, I'm working on a review of the literature on this subject, and there is not enough research on these families. If there is anything, it's with very small samples. It is a difficult population to research. So I can see why a lot of researchers shy away because it probably would take a long time to gather people who want to participate and whatnot. But I think it's completely doable, and you can also document their experiences from the perspectives of their therapists, the people in their lives. I mean, there's so much about their world that it has not been discussed in research, but it's starting to. And what I've been very motivated by is a shift to more strengths-based approaches to working with these families, which in the field of youth sexual offending, it's been cognitive restructuring, psychoeducation, things like that, but not a lot of, you know, not a lot of strength based, not a lot of person and environment. Although that's something that I'm sure a lot of therapists do try to accomplish, it is very hard when the system is requiring you to do certain things or to work in certain ways. Um, I moved away from working with a population for that very reason. I felt constricted in how I could help, and pretty hopeless actually when I was working with them. But you know, coming back to it from a research perspective, and I think creating movement that way is definitely reconnecting me with my passion for working with these folks. They really need a lot of help, honestly. They do. And they're not getting help that is person first always.
Right, because I mean the conversation probably generally surrounds the victims in such cases, but often, and I'm sure that many of the people that you're working with or working on with the research are also victims of sexual trauma.
Gosh,
Yeah.
yes. Not to throw numbers there, but it's a pretty alarming number. The research says that about 60 to 80% of youth who sexually offended were sexually victimized themselves. Um, in addition to that, the parents of those youth have also had experiences of sexual victimization too in their childhoods. So we're thinking about there's a generational issue going on of sexual abuse and not being addressed. And then, unfortunately, in the US, sexuality education is so bad. It's not comprehensive at all. Interestingly, though, when a youth commits a sexual crime, then they get thrown all of this information about consent and all these things. And usually these kids are like, oh, it makes sense. But had they gotten that before, they started to have feelings, sexual feelings, and sexual temptations, and committing a sexual crime, then they probably would have never committed that crime if they truly understood what consent means and all of that, those things. But we're very reactive as a society, and so we are doing things backwards, just consequencing people, punishing kids, families, where we could be doing it differently, and it would really benefit everyone if we were just providing comprehensive sexuality education to everyone.
Right.
Developmentally appropriate, and there's ways of doing that.
Yeah, well, it's again, it kind of like the general narrative around sexuality, like let's just say North America, but where it's kind of this, it's a biological urge. I mean, if it's something you can become addicted to, it's like a drug, right? It's like cocaine. So there's an urge, and then you're just going to act on this urge. So are you the kind of person that just doesn't have the willpower, whatever that narrative is, right? And I think that I think you wrote somewhere or maybe posted something about it's okay, there's the urges and then there's the meaning we attribute to those urges that come in a sociocultural context. And so if you're just providing context for someone that may have never had that, if they've been sexually abused and then they're part of this intergenerational chain of sexual abuse, like why would they have any idea about consent?
Yeah, absolutely. And if we're not teaching about it, then we can't expect people to know how to behave. Also, sexuality, sex and sexuality is something that is very hush hush, taboo, and talk about it. But I'm thinking about I forget exactly where I read this, but if I tell you right now to think about ice cream, first thing, right? You're gonna think about ice cream. If I tell you don't think about ice cream, you still will think about ice cream. And so I think if kids are hearing constantly, oh, sex, don't talk about it, it makes them more curious. And not having the tools to navigate that curiosity, it's very dangerous.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the number, I think people don't know this, but it's the number of kids who are, out of all the sexual offenses committing, at least in America, um, I believe it's a 30% is youth
Okay.
who committed a sexual. That's a big number. And
Mm-hmm.
so when we're thinking sex offenders and we use that label and we stigmatize that label, there's a lot of children in that that we're stigmatizing and labeling. So yeah, it's why not provide comprehensive sexuality education that's developmentally appropriate when we have such a big number of kids committing sexual offenses.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's like coming, yeah, again, like what I'm sort of hearing, or what I kind of assume, is that in the cultural context, we just say, well, you know, it's again, it's like the problems within the person. So it's
Mhm.
not about education. It's just they were sort of like born to have this potential to commit this crime. And
Totally.
and so hopefully your research is pulling out, well, we know that the truth, so, and research should approximate us or get us close to the truth, but this idea of like, well, this is, yeah, culturally, is born within a cultural context and a familial context, and there's, I mean, when you probably take each individual, there's like three main problem stories, not just the single story of them as a sex offender, them as a
Right.
victim of sexual trauma, in a family of sexual trauma, you know
And it's the story, but also the meaning that we attributed to that story, right? And we know that when a person is sexually victimized, they have to make sense of what happened. And when all of that is going on up here with no one to talk to or a context to facilitate a different interpretation, it often the interpretations are often dangerous, right? We might internalize that we deserved it or that we did something that made it happen, and then we might think that it's okay to do that to other people, especially if we're really young. This happens. We might believe that it's okay. It's just there's so much that can be mitigated if we stepped in sooner as just part of helping people live their best lives, giving them the tools about all aspects of life, including sexuality.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like, yeah, how to navigate food, sex, like exercise, it's like
Everything.
it's
Yeah,
functions of life,
everything. And when we have the luxury in our country, in North America, to have early age education. And why not use that opportunity to do it really well, to create a really strong society that is culturally aware, that is self-aware. It would really it would improve our culture by a lot.
Because I know you will work in couples as well, and as a sex therapist, and sort of work within the context of couples therapy. Like what have you seen show up there? So we're talking maybe not about, well, maybe there is sexual offense happening within those stories, but likely a lot of sexual shame, or these breakdowns within couples surrounding sex, and yeah, like seeing how that cultural context kind of leads to these issues that are just manifesting later on in relationships. Yeah, what were you seeing in that work?
Oh my gosh. So one of the main things that I saw, that probably number one thing that I saw was infidelity. And because I was focusing a lot on issues related to sexual compulsivity or addiction, um, a lot of the couples that I saw had some sort of sexual addiction issue going on. That was one, and also just like myths about what couples should be like. Um, if we're not having sex enough, and I'm thinking, okay, what is enough? And where do you get that idea from? And obviously movies, and how we have romanticized the idea of the one, the soulmate, all of it. I see a lot of people who are single and who are, for lack of a better word, desperate to finding the one. Where does that idea come from? And what does that even mean? Um, but yeah, with couples, it was just a lot of that, right? And so if you're in a relationship and there's a lot of friction or things are not matching your concept of the one,
Yeah.
then you question, is this the person I should have married or the person? And all of that just creates a lot of tension and challenges in the relationship. It's never going to be perfect. Back in 2011, I think, in school, a guest speaker said to us, there is there is no chance that one person will light up all of our Christmas tree lights, right? We're gonna need more than just one. This was a conversation about polyamory. But if we understand that, okay, we are choosing monogamy and we have to be okay with only certain needs being met, you can't ask one person to accomplish everything for you. And you have to be okay with that, right? And there's got to be commitment and compromise involved in that. I'll say I'm not an expert on couples work whatsoever, but I would help couples see themselves as, their own union, a commitment that they've made with themselves, for themselves, and to understand what they want to build together outside of the influences of society. And understanding that there's always going to be influences, but really to define to name the problem that's affecting their relationship, to externalize their relationship, to see their relationship as another entity, to engage in different ways of relating to the relationship, all of that. And I say you have a relationship with one person, like let's say if you're having a monogamous relationship, but you're also having a relationship with the messages that they've received. You're having a relationship with their family dynamics. You're having a relationship with any traumatic events of their lives. You're having a relationship with a younger version of that person. So you're having a relationship with more than just that one person. And so we have to be just a lot more open to imperfection and to just building something based on what we have.
Yeah, and with all of your exes too. They're all
Exactly.
involved in some way.
Unfortunately, but all of those stories, right? Relationships that we've had in the past, they've taught us something about ourselves or made us believe something about ourselves, whether true or not. We're having relationships with all of that as well.
It's really interesting actually, because it's like there's each individual's sexuality and all of the stories, like there's a bunch of narratives in there, and then there's where the relationship sexuality occurs, because it's not going to be all the Christmas tree lights. So what is good for us, and in this moment too? Maybe it wasn't the same 5 years ago, won't be the same in 5 years. Like maybe we're cool with sex once a week or once a month. Maybe this is just how our maybe these are just the Christmas tree lights that we're lighting right now.
And it has to be a compromise, and if one person is not okay with sex less than once a week, let's say, then maybe this is not a relationship that you guys need to be in. Or maybe it is a relationship that you need to be in for some reasons, and then maybe it needs to be opened up for that person to have those needs met somewhere else. There's so many alternatives for resolution for these kinds of things. We think it's either or, right? We think it's either divorce or we stay together and compromise, but there's more. There's always a lot more options, and we don't consider them because there's a lot of other cultural issues at play.
Right. And because we haven't externalized the relationship. So once you externalize the relationship as its own separate entity, you can start to say, oh, we can like mold this to actually fit a thing that we want,
Yeah. And the relationship, it's really fun. Couples therapy is really hard to actually be in the room and doing it. And I enjoyed it many times, so there are a lot of other times that I did it. But one of the things that I enjoyed the most was externalizing the relationship and really exploring, like, the relationship has its hopes too, its values. And what would you say to the relationship when you first met? Like, that's when the relationship was born. So how do you want to nurture that relationship? Did you do it the way that you wish you had done it? Can you do it differently now? Would the relationship be okay with that shift right now? So
All the
it's
good
like
narrative.
fun ways of talking with people about their lives. Yeah.
It's beautiful. I love those externalizing conversations. You're reminding me of them because it's been a while since I really like dived into like doing that, you know? And it's so beautiful because it creates an entirely different conversation you never would have had when you start referring to things in that way. Opens up a whole line of, it opens up so many possibilities, you know?
Mhm. Absolutely.
Mm,
With any kind of conversation, specifically with externalizing, I always have, and I'll share this with you and your listeners because I would share this, and my students know me for these. I used to call them, I don't know what I call them today, but my like tenets of my work, and I learned these through my mentors. And one of them is to be curious, right? To always be curious, whatever that means to you. And you have to build a relationship with what that means to you as well. And it should change over time and with whoever you're working with. Then staying close. We are as therapists, as helping professionals, we kind of have this idea that the helping is the goal, but there shouldn't be a goal necessarily other than establishing a good, healthy, helpful relationship.
mm,
And staying close means that when people say, to truly listening to what people are saying and to ask questions about what they're saying and not questions that are based on our psychiatric criterion or our agendas for the day, but it's truly about what they're telling us. Then the other thing that I do is getting into the details. It's really difficult to know and interpret and understand a story fully if we're not getting into details about those stories, right? We got to fill in those gaps. And so it could be something as simple as, if you could transport yourself back to that day, that moment, tell me what you're seeing through your eyes, tell me what you're hearing, and just very, very staying as close as possible. Um, Also, if people say something, um, you know, note, like, hear the words. If you don't know where to go with it, just ask a question about one of the words that was said. That will keep you close and will allow you to get into the details.
mm,
And the last one is most important to me because it's the most challenging to me. Um, and for most people, I think, is to get in touch with that inner child and engage in your imagination. uh, Asking questions that involve metaphor. I've had a client who was really into motorcycles, so I always ask questions that involve some sort of motorcycle metaphor. Um, it really was personal to him, and it made sense to him to answer these questions about other things in their lives from that idea of a motorcycle perspective. Um,
mm,
One of them, yeah, some of the most beautiful conversations have been the imaginative conversations with youth, because they have so many dreams and things that they like. You can always create beautiful questions, um, that are very person first, very attached to those dreams. So I say engaging the imagination in a person first way is probably the most fun, very important, and I think it's the thing that creates most movement, I think, at least in what I've seen in my practice.
mhm. Because sometimes in a session, an image will come up, you know, and then to share that image, every time I've done that in a session, my patient has always been like, then the engagement is just, we're really close in that moment because it's
Mhm.
colorful and it exists and it's no longer this abstract kind of impersonal concept, you
Yeah.
know. And if your life or if your psyche or consciousness is involved with motorcycles, if that takes up a big part of your identity and you just understand life in sort of motorcycle terms, and then you're applying these other experiences and sort of that's sort of how you see life or how you can work with life. So when you're saying, you know, it's like you're, I don't even know a motorcycle metaphor, but like,
It's been a while. I don't know. I did a little bit of research myself so that I could ask these questions. But anything, I had a client who was into surfing, and I
yeah,
would ask questions about,
some
ocean,
good
waves,
metaphors and
yeah,
beautiful.
movement. I mean,
Yeah.
You, I had a client who was in musical theater. So the idea of this, I remember using this metaphor and sharing it with students of uh, who got the spotlight. So if he was on stage, what aspect of this life has been getting the spotlight? Is there something in the ensemble, another character that you want to bring into the front and demote the main character of your play? Like these ideas that were just like happen in the moment, because you're in tune with the client's story. And and this imagination practice only is possible if you're attuned, if you really are connected, with the person, not someone who tells you that they played the guitar one time and then you ask a metaphor question about guitar playing. No, but it's truly about precious, treasured aspects of their living. And they my experience has been that people really appreciate it when you can put something together for them that really makes them think about their lives in such close proximity, um, in ways that are so rich to them, so meaningful. It makes sense, yes. And think about something that you love to do, that in and out, and you can use that as a metaphor for anything else in your life.
It really, yeah.
Mhm.
Because actually, as you're talking, I was thinking about, I'm also a surfer, and I'm like, there's every concept in life can also be, you can use surfing as an analogy for everything.
Mhm.
But why am I drawn to surfing? Because I saw that as an analogy for everything. I remember watching people surf before I even tried it myself, and there was this like perseverance getting through the white water. Like I was watching this guy just get pushed back and then paddle back and then push back and making no progress, and then he gets out, and I was like, this is life, this is what I'm going through right now. I need to do this sport to learn some
Wow.
answers from it.
And that's like how I'm hearing this in such a unique interpretation of that, right? And I remember that client, his interpretation was a little bit different.
Yeah.
And so that's what's beautiful. It's like all of the ways that you're interpreting the one thing, they're going to be very unique because you have a personal story to it. So, in a personal relationship with it as well.
And that's it. Yeah. And I mean, a good metaphor is so important for a story, it's really
Always.
not quite the same without good metaphors and, enriched language. And yeah, and also bringing in the characters, like remembering conversations, where, like, let's say you have the remorse story. So asking somebody, because you start off with remorse in the moment, perhaps, of the act that was committed, but then there's a past involved. So it's like, who would
Yes.
know that you would feel so guilty about this? It's like, oh, this
Yeah.
person. And then you can bring that up, or bring that in to the fore, and
Absolutely. Yeah. Like tracing the history of the thing that they are experiencing in that moment. I, I also like to, I've used this as an exercise in class. Like I said, I would bring narrative all the time. There was a class about substance use, and here I am doing an exercise about something else, tracing the history of your values, I think it was. And um, what I would do is, you identify, like, for instance, guilt, and I would question more guilt. And before I start tracing the history, it may be that it's not necessarily guilt, but it's about um, uh, um, kindness, like being kind to others. I feel guilty because I was not kind. And so I might say kindness, like, how do you learn about kindness? What is kindness? Is there someone who comes to mind who may have instilled this idea of kind, and not just about kindness, but this particular idea of kindness in you? Can you tell me how that happened? Can you tell me the story of that time? And then you do the close questioning, the in the details questioning, and then you can bring in the imagination. What's beautiful about this is that there's such a long trajectory um, the history of that thing, right? Of kindness, for instance. And then when I invited the parents, I am thinking of one particular case that was a thing that was part of their lives too. And they thought about their parents who were not even alive anymore. And that kid is sitting there in the room hearing their parents talk about this is actually a thing about our family. And look how strong this thing is and how far it goes back. That has to make that person feel really confident in that as a thing that they truly value and that they can truly bring forward. Um, so it's just being really attuned to what's happening and going with the flow. I mean,
That's
going with the flow.
It's amazing. Yeah, because we always talk about intergenerational trauma, intergenerational problem stories, and many families have intergenerational like strength stories or these stories of pride. But that was probably a story that was not told until you
Yeah.
started to thicken it.
Or if it was told, it was just kind of told in passing and not really like, if something big and bad happens, then that gets talked about over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
But stories that may speak of kindness or helpfulness or other things like that, sometimes they're just told, sometimes, like you said, not even told. And they kind of just go unnoticed. They become subjugated by the problems.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so powerful because they walk out of that session going, I come from a lineage of kindness.
Yeah.
You know, in a particular flavor of kindness, not just, regular kindness. This is how it shows up in
And there's
our
a
in our family.
story. It's a story of kindness that was told, and then I look at the sister and I'm like, do you think, oh yeah, and then there's another story of kindness, and then the mom is just listening to this and I'm like, oh, and there's another one about my grandma, and so there's like all of, okay, so this is a family of kindness, isn't it? And to walk away, like you said, with that idea, I was like, how confident that I can really be more intentional in how I use kindness as a value in my life to allow me to create relationships, to engage in particular behaviors, to change what's problematic. I mean, the sky's the limit, really.
Mm-hmm. Right, because now you've just handed them a strength that was always there, but now I'm walking out of it with this goblet in my hand of
Yeah,
kindness.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And that confidence of it, right? Like it's
Mm-hmm.
just how you allow that to become internalized, because
Mm-hmm.
that's what we want internalized is it's not my goal to have people internalize things, but sometimes, internalizing is kind of an aspect of living condition. I do believe that we just are, we just as humans tend to internalize. And so if that's something that may happen, then I want to give all of the options, all of the alternatives to my clients that they can say, you know what, this is the story that I want to keep with me in my heart and the one that I want to lead. Um, that's to me is really powerful. It's how I choose to live my life, and it's been very helpful. It's gotten me to where I am today, with the problem still in my backpack, but making it lighter and easier to carry.
Mm-hmm. Right, because you have these other skills and knowledges and strengths and ways of responding to help you carry the backpack.
You know what's a metaphor that just came to mind? Having moved here from Colorado, in Colorado, a lot of people do rock climbing. And when you start, you may not have the calluses that are needed to be able to have a good grasp on those rocks, but eventually you do have that. And so whatever you're carrying, your own weight, or if you have a backpack with you, it'll be easier, because you have now new tools in your hands that will allow you to carry that baggage with you. So I just kind of thought about that, and I think that that's true. We live and we create new skills, we create new experiences that are supposed to carry us forward. So what are those experiences that we're opening ourselves up to? Is the thing. Is we want to choose wisely, and more problem stories not only will thicken the story, but will make it harder for us to develop new skills, new ways of being.
Right. Yeah. Because even with the example of kindness, it's like there can be these little moments like, oh yeah, I know I can do kind things, but maybe everybody does, or maybe it's sort of I'm acting out of character. But when you start to thicken it, it's no, this is who I am, or there's a thick thread of this that is going to go into the future, you know, if I prefer that if I choose it for it to do that. So it gives you the that possibility that it ingrains it a little bit more than not just, oh, this might randomly happen, but it's not really within my control or doesn't really align with my preference. It's just going to be a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, I'm going to walk out of this session with this idea of kindness, and it's going to influence everything I do because
Mm-hmm.
it's now part of my identity in some way.
Like having worked with sexual minorities, very highly stigmatized sexual minorities, that they might come in to see me because they have this anxiety that they might have an attraction to children. I've had clients like that. They've never offended and they're terrified they're going to offend, and they come to see me and I'm like, wow, you're willing to take this risk to talk to a stranger about something that's so highly stigmatized, probably the most stigmatized identity in the world, because you don't want to offend. What a response. And that is what I want to story. That's what's going to help me help you not offend ever.
Right.
Right.
Right. Because you have this deep desire that you're willing to take a huge risk for to not do this. So that's a huge story.
Incredible. It's incredible. And it's, so much respect for those folks because they're willing to take such a risk. A lot of the men that came and talked to me, they thought, many of them, that I would report them, but they still were coming to talk to me. There's obviously nothing to report if they only have an attraction and they haven't acted on it. But they were willing to take that risk, and that speaks volumes of the person that they could, if allowed, to actually pay attention to actually be the person that they continue to intentionally be moving forward.
Yeah. And I think this kind of comes up too if we think of suicidal ideation, that whole spectrum, and how, it can be really difficult. Well, there can be a really reactive response from clinicians, more from a legal perspective, to try and, manage legal responsibility, which is not client-centered at all. Well, it is client-centered in a sense, but it's legal centered, let's say. And how somebody then may feel really hesitant to actually talk about that because they're worried about the fear that might come from the practitioners that they're working with or being hospitalized, when we're really talking about ideation. We're talking about ideas, and it actually is an act of courage and a response to perhaps not preferring that as an outcome, that someone's coming in and talking about it. And so our responsibility as clinicians is to listen, like you said, be curious.
Listen. And I always, initial conversation with clients, one of the things that you have to do as a therapist is assess for suicidality. One of the things that I do is I initially, before I even ask the question, I normalize it. I say, if that's ever been a thing, a lot of people actually go through with it because they didn't have anybody to talk about it with. You talking about it and telling me that you're thinking about it doesn't mean that I'm going to report you. It means that we have an opportunity to talk about it. So it's not just kind of like similar with the sexuality taboo idea, right? If you don't expose that, it becomes a secret that can become very toxic. And so I always welcome, and I make it a very explicit statement, especially when the person has some significant depression, helplessness, hopelessness issue, that this is a conversation that I am more than willing to have, because suicidality looks very different for everybody, or at least the thinking, the intention, the intent is different for everybody. And a lot of times people just want to be able to say, sometimes I really don't want to live. I think this is really hard. And you sit with that. And that, unfortunately, a lot of therapists react very quickly to someone speaking of suicide. But to me, that's an opportunity to prevent it. It's a conversation that can be really helpful. Also, we run to the safety planning and things like that. And I've been fortunate that none of my clients have ever committed suicide. But what I do is, instead of a safety plan, which is what we're taught to do, I make sure that my conversation is the safety plan. And then at the end of that conversation, it is unpacked as if it had been a safety plan. We talked about this, and that, and then there's a documentation there that they get to sign, and that we co-create. So it's different ways that we can do this with the constraints that we as therapists have. Especially we work at an agency, we have to have certain documentation, certain procedure. We can get creative, we need to bring the creative back into the therapist. We just kind of have become so accustomed to following the rules of the agencies that agencies, as long as you get them what they want, you can do it whatever way you can get there whatever way you want. Just get them what they want.
Yeah, because I mean the checklist is, you can check off the things on the list by having a narrative conversation, but it doesn't have to look that way or feel that way.
Exactly.
Yeah, you can get the information that's necessary.
I know a lot of narrative. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I was gonna say I know a lot of narrative therapists who decided to go into private practice right off school because they didn't want to be constrained in agencies. And I do find that doesn't have to be, again, it's this either or. And as narrative therapists, we know that there shouldn't be an either or, but it's so ingrained in our minds that, I worked in agencies for a long time, but I did have that initial feeling in the beginning that I didn't, because I wanted to have the freedom to be a narrative therapist in my own practice. But what I learned is that there were so many wonderful ways of being a narrative therapist in an agency. And guess what? Those places need narrative therapists. They need strength-based practitioners who are willing to provide those systems with what they require, but at the same time, provide a service that it's quality service to their clients. It can be done, and it's not that hard.
Yeah, exactly. Like we just, as long as you follow your tenets, if you're following your tenets, you can work within that framework and still make it deep and therapeutic and yeah. And it's, I mean, yeah, because so we're supposed to be doing a safety plan, right? Like that's what the agency wants from us, but safety becomes a story now that we're pulling out, right? So so you came and you shared these thoughts with me, so and now
very true, becomes a story. Yes. And I don't know, can you imagine sitting there as a client, you're in your teens, and you just told something so deeply personal to this person who's supposed to be helping you, and the first thing that they do is they pull out this form to fill out with you about your suicidal thinking. Oh my gosh, no. I just thinking about it and makes me laugh, like we need to sit with those tough conversations. That's what we were trained to do. And I understand why we shy away from that, because we're also part of a system. But we need to, that's the most radical thing we can do, right? Is to really challenge it by still managing to get our work done, but do what needs to happen for the person. Sometimes it adds a little bit more work. For instance, my intakes, some people have the form and they type them as they talk with the person. I would just have a conversation. And then, yes, I had to spend an hour later typing that, but you negotiate how you're going to do that and what you're going to sacrifice. And for me, those conversations, especially those initial conversations with my clients, were more important to me. That it was worth it to spend the extra half an hour or an hour typing an intake. It was more important to me. So, but there's ways of doing that, There's ways of doing that always. You just have to get creative.
Yeah, it's like conducting the conversation in Spanish and then charting it in English. It's like you're using the language of the person, and then you're just charting in the language you need to chart for the agency.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Been there, done that.
Yeah, right? Same. I know. It's like, yeah, it's better to do it afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And also, like, the words that people tell us, we might miss some of these really important words that deserve a full story. So It's good to just hear people. And I'm always, my notes are just a bunch of words. Because those words to me are entry points into story development. But the words the people tell you, especially when your questions are thoughtful and crafted in a person first manner, those answers are just they're so valuable and so meaningful, excuse me, in the work moving forward.
Because yeah, they're chosen, right? The words are, like you said, entryway. You know, is
Yeah,
it guilt or is it remorse? That's
yeah.
two different storylines, right?
Or is it kindness? I mean, how could you even like you know, attach guilt to kindness? Asking the very curious questions. You don't know. And if I just heard guilt and I storied guilt without unpacking it, I may be storing a storyline that may not be that helpful. So just keep asking. Don't just sit with the one thing. Keep asking, keep asking, keep asking, and then go with the flow. There is a path. You just have to keep going with it.
Right, because yeah, if you miss kindness, you miss the intergenerational kindness and the future of kindness. And maybe you get something out of guilt. Maybe there's a good story there, you know, that's helpful, but it's not like the kindness story that's like rich, you know.
We really are facilitators of people's expertise of their lives, right? I think we don't get asked questions about our life generally, and people don't ask themselves a lot of questions. They say, "Why am I like that?" or "Why is this happening to me?" But no, those other deeper, meaningful questions. And you know, I feel like sure, part of my training has gotten me to be able to ask those questions and help people in those ways. But a lot of it has been personal practice. You know, we're always trying to figure ourselves out. And when we've had really difficult lives, we have been practicing. We have been thinking about it so much. And the suffering sometimes has led to a lot of expertise. And, you know, that's initially what I like to think of myself as somebody who is, you know, 50% my training and 50% my personal experience. Um, and I think that that's the magic that I can offer is based on the combination of those two things. I don't think I could do either without one without the other. I need both. And I'm not talking about self-disclosure or nothing like that. I'm talking about just understanding what the awareness that you've gained through your own work, your own fight, and try to understand how that might be applicable with some of the training or the knowledge that you've gained through your schooling or your education to help the people that you're working with. People come to therapy with a lot of hope, and I think we owe it to them to do that, to be human, to acknowledge our own shed and use it to bring some change for them.
Right, as part of that empathetic process too, and that connection, the closeness part of it, it doesn't need to be explicitly shared, but there is a sharing that occurs implicitly, you know.
Yeah. And I'm learning every day. You know, like to this day, I still notice when I'm a little tense in a therapy session and I'm thinking, oh, I'm not being authentically myself. Let me get rid of this heavy thing. And then acknowledge that as I'm going, because we can't just, sure, it's all about person centered. It's really about the client, but we can't really remove ourselves from that. It's just impossible. We are part of there. Our stories and everything else is there. So if a client says something that makes us think of someone we know or an experience we've had, it's okay to tap into that as you're listening and allow that to also be part of the questioning. You know, it's not, I don't say to people, oh, you made me think of this thing about my life. It's more about, they made me think about this about my life, and whatever I learned or whatever I experienced from that thing about my life, I used to craft a question for them about their lives. That's how we can, you know, negotiate those natural, very organic things that will happen to us as therapists in the room. Not talking about counter transparency or none of that. It's just natural human experience.
Yeah, because images form in a conversation, right? To share those images, and of course they're based on our experience, you know. And like you said, if you're close, then often those images will be related to the client, where it's like, oh, this person's a surfer and it's a surfing image, but there's something that's conjured up that's based, that's rooted in your own experience and your, but there's a co-creation. I don't know if I love that word, but there is this this creation happening, collaboration.
Yeah, David Epstein calls it the one of the co-creators of narrative. He calls it co-research, and I really love that idea because it is truly researching, and we're doing it together, and it's questions. And I like when clients ask me questions too. It's just it feels very. We have there's no positioning. There's roles, and we play those roles on the same level. And I think that that's how I imagine co-creating or co-researching in therapy. It's interesting what's happening with us, because we started talking about labels and problem stories, right? And so in the conversation, we've moved to talking about kindness and the metaphors, and we haven't really even touched on the sexual offending and stuff like that. This is what happens with clients, is that they come in with these really thickened stories about their lives, and then the conversation just always becomes not neglectful of the problem, but just like more hopeful because they've made more room for just more. It's richer.
Yeah. I really found that with working with in a narrative context, which when I was learning, it was more like, okay, it's sort of an intention you bring in where it's a curiosity, and then this double listening for the subordinate stories. And so I brought that in when I was doing work with street involved youth. And so if someone would come in deep problem story, almost like a heavy energy in the room, and brief encounters as well, which I know there's a lot of research with narrative and brief therapeutic encounters. And I remember at the end of the 20-minute session, she's talking about her dog and how much she loves her dog and the kind of person she is, what her dog would say to her that she's dealing with this, what her dog would say about her. The room is light. I feel less hopeless because when working with that particular patient, was like, I can't change all this stuff she's going through, all this crap in her life. It's not even stuff I've experienced, so in terms of the specifics, and so when we could then just give her a little bit of a story about her and her dog, or her as a caregiver, her as a companion, it was like, okay, amazing, and I connected with her so much deeper, in a more deeper way, because I was like, this is someone who I now feel like I know a little bit better, like a little bit of a friendship started to form in that sense of like, I see her as a person,
It's very imaginative, right, for you to engage in a conversation involving her pet, her dog, such an important character in her story. And I was telling my husband probably a few years ago, but this is something that really stuck with me. We have a dog that's been with us, thankfully, for a very long time now. But I said to my husband, he is the only one who knows everything about me. He sees everything. When no one's watching, he's watching, and he knows my ugly, he knows my beautiful, he knows my good and my bad, and he's still there by my side. And yes, if he could talk, I think he would say some of the things that I see in myself, but that I don't allow myself to tell myself. And what a beautiful idea that our pets have this kind of insider knowledge on our lives.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And that they don't abandon us. That's the key. That with knowing all of it about us, that there's still the most unconditional love.
Yeah, you can get really thick stories out of pets or storybook characters, stuffed animals, which is difficult because many people in certain contexts don't have a lot of people, that you could start to use remembering conversations, but you could pull stories from. So it's like, okay, yeah, your dog, you know, because I think she said something in I forget the conversation specifically, but I remember something about like, oh, I can't stay long because my dog's outside, you know, and then we had oh, it sucks you can't bring your dog into the facility, you know, and then it went deep, you know, and yeah, and I mean, I still didn't take away the specifics that were causing the distress and the suffering and the context she was in, but the energy of that conversation was not a problem story anymore. Yeah, it was really powerful. It was really great. And I know when I first started, you know, this idea of, oh, well, when you're, you know, sort of externalizing problems or thickening subordinate stories that are more, let's say, positive, are you negating the problem? You're not really allowing someone to then talk about the problem, but it's not it's not like that. It's not like you're like, oh, that's nice, you know, you have all these problems, okay, let's talk about your dog and how he loves you. It's
Well,
not like that at
it's
all.
also just looking at the problem in context.
Mm.
You know, when a lot of people question when I externalize the experiences of youth who committed sexual offenses, is they question that not holding them accountable for the sexual offense that they committed, right? But to me, it's just no, I'm just expanding their identity story, their life story, so that they can see the action of having committed a sexual offense in that context. And I think that that allows for people to take a more authentic sort of accountability for what they did. It's actually completely the opposite than not taking responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is so good. Is there any last thoughts you have, Mauricio? This is a great combo.
Oh, this was great. A lot longer than I thought, but I can always talk about this stuff for hours. And listen, I haven't had these conversations in a while because for the last year, I've been so immersed in research and talking about numbers and quantitative and qualitative. um, so this is really wonderful. I'm fortunate to still have some clients that I work with, but as you know, like being in school, getting a doctorate, it's my life has been transformed from being a therapist. Now I'm primarily more a researcher, and so this was really a nice moment for me to really just get back in touch with a passion of mine. So I thank you for giving me that opportunity. It's very cool.
And thank you for waking up these narrative conversations in me, because you speak about them so beautifully, and it reminds me of that feeling that I felt when I was in the summer intensive of like, oh, this is the stuff I want to do, you know. But then trying to find, yeah.
I've been to a lot of trainings in narrative. I went to Vancouver. I worked with even David Epstein, but the Toronto narrative it really shifted something within me. It really was a very powerful week. And my husband came with me to Toronto, and we talk about that as the best trip that we had because, well, not only do we both love Toronto a lot, but and I've been back. I was back a few times, but I um I think it was such a good trip because I was in such a good mental state because of the trainings that were daily.
Yeah.
I was so excited and so hopeful the whole time that our trip was so good. And then after that, we went to Montreal, and the whole trip was so beautiful. And so we always talk fondly of our time in Toronto, but also just like that training. That training was just so good, and it felt so good. It felt so good the whole time.
It did, yeah. Maybe we'll see each other for level 2 at some point.
Yeah, I would love to go back to it. They still have that school, right?
Yeah, they do. And they opened up level 2 for summer intensive and trauma intensive. So,
I may just do that.
yeah,
Maybe not this year, but next year, I
yeah,
may just do that.
yeah, we should. We'll be in touch and we'll go together. We'll do it.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. That would be great. I love Canada. I want to move to Canada, but
Oh,
I'm sure that a lot of Americans want to move to Canada now. Um, I
cool.
know, like you said, it has its issues, but I don't know. Toronto is definitely a place that I'm considering after I graduate because
You
it's just
should definitely come. Bring warm coats, but but we get a few warm months. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a mental gymnastics that I have to engage with to convince myself that it would be a good idea, but I think it would be okay.
It's good to do a trial visit in the midst of January or February and just, okay, I
When
think it
it's like really bad.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would struggle with the snow, but listen, for the right job and the right connections and the right community, I think I'm willing to make some sacrifices. It's always a trade-off, they say so.
Yeah. And there's heating, you know.
Exactly.
Saunas, like there's ways around it. There are warm coats, like yeah.
Cool city.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Mauricio. This
Wow.
was so great.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I would love
Yeah.
to see
Yeah.
what we talked about. Okay, cool. Well, it was so nice to see you and chatting